Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. We have a nice full house today. It's been said that familiarity breeds contempt. And to be honest, I wish this saying wasn't true. But we've seen this, haven't we? Far too often, immature people mistreat those closest to them. It's sad, but we see this in every different relationship. We see this in domestic abuse, where a husband abuses his wife, or a wife abuses her husband, or parents abuse their children, or children abuse their parents. Those who are closest, those who should be caring for each other, mistreating one another. We see this in the mistreatment of close friends. You've probably seen situations where people who had been close friends harm each other in horrible ways, whether it be physical or emotional or social. And we see it in toxic work environments, where again, people who should be working together to a common goal end up hurting each other. And it's not right. It's immaturity. But it's not always this way. Not every relationship is this way. That saying that familiarity breeds contempt is not always true, because the mature protect those closest to them. Now you notice the contrast there. The immature harm those close to them. The mature protect those close to them. Now why is that? Why is it that the mature have such a drastic difference than the immature? Well, a big part of it is that mature relationships require self-awareness and self-control. Self-awareness to recognize how your actions impact those around you. Your words, your deeds, how those are going to affect those around you. But also then the self-control to do the actions that protect others rather than the actions that harm others. Now that's what we want to be, right? We want to be mature folks. We want to be people who are aware of what our actions do to others. We want to be people who are in control of our own actions. So today, as we're continuing our sermon series about the mature Christian walk, we are talking about mature relationships. We'll be studying Ephesians 5:22 through 6:9. And you notice there's a chapter break in there, because our chapter breaks aren't always all that great. Sometimes they break up a context. And so what we're going to do today is we're first going to do a quick recap of our context. Because again, this isn't two separate discussions. There's a context that flows through the entire section. Then we're going to talk about mature husband-wife relationships, then mature parent-child relationships, and finally mature slave and master relationships. And what we're going to see as we work our way through this is that immaturity causes problems in each of these different relationships. And so to show the love of Christ, we must strive to be mature in each of these relationships. Now you'll notice as we go through this that this sermon is going to be a little bit repetitive. And I did that on purpose, not because I'm lazy, but because the same immaturity that causes problems in husband-wife relationships causes problems in parent-child relationships and causes problems in work relationships. And we do this funny compartmentalization thing where we may be mature with one relationship, but then be completely immature in another relationship. So we're going to talk about those same immaturities in all three of those relationship sections. So, with that having been said, let's do a quick context recap. Back to Ephesians 5:17 through 21. We studied this in depth last week. If you weren't here for that, the sermon recording is on our website and on our YouTube channel. You can look it up in your free time. But in that section, we learned that we avoid being foolish by imitating God and striving to please Him. He said, therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. So we avoid being foolish by imitating God and striving to please Him. He then tells us how to be filled with the Spirit. He says, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your hearts to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father. Now notice this last bit, because oftentimes we focus on the singing and making melody, and then we tack on, oh yeah, and be subject to one another in the Lord. But think about what he said there. Being filled with the Spirit includes submitting to our fellow Christians. Okay, that's a big thing right there. What does that mean exactly? Does this mean that any instruction given to us by any Christian we have to follow without question? Someone says, hey, I need $100, we have to fork over $100? No, that's not what it's talking about. But what is it talking about? Well, not coincidentally, Paul then goes into a discussion of 3 different relationships that require submitting to one another. Context, context, context. So, let's jump in and let's talk about that first relationship. Mature husband and wife relationships. Ephesians 5:22 through 33. And Paul starts out talking to the wife. And you'll notice in each of these 3 sections, Paul follows a pattern. He talks to the one that is supposed to be in subjection, and then he talks to the one that is supposed to be in authority. So he says, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. Okay, so first off, wives, it says be subject to whom? To your own husband. It's not saying you have to be subject to every male person around, but to your own husband as to the Lord. Why? For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church. Now, we're all aware that our immature world rebels against this concept. Bringing this concept up in many different circles will result in people's hackles getting going up and people getting really fiery because they see submitting as giving up their personal autonomy. They see the idea of submitting to their husband as giving up their freedom. That they don't want to be subject to anyone. Now, a lot of that comes from a misunderstanding of what it means to be in subjection, what it means to be submitting to your husband. But before we jump into that, I want to remind us of our context. The bigger context, we learned that being filled with the Spirit includes submitting to our fellow Christians. So this isn't just wives. This is all of us needing to be subject to our fellow Christians. See, submitting to another does not mean relinquishing your personhood. Submitting to another doesn't mean that you are giving up all your freedoms and who you are as an individual. Because notice what he says here. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. So Paul introduces the comparison or the similarity between the husband-wife relationship and the relationship between Christ and his church. And he'll flesh that out more as he talks to the husband. But I want you to think about something with this. It's not always easy for the church to submit to Christ's authority. You ever notice that? I mean, after all, that's why there's so many different religious groups out there. That's why there's so many denominations out there. Because somewhere, someone along the line said, you know what, I don't want to submit. I don't want to do what Christ said to do, so I'm going to do my own thing. See, the church needs maturity and humility to submit to Christ's authority. Humility to know that, well, the church isn't God. And maturity to actually exercise that self-control. Now he says to the wife to submit as the church submits to Christ. It takes maturity and humility to submit to your husband. See, a mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual strengths and needs. And you think about that. Our modern world tends to structure the discussion about submitting in an abusive light. We're not talking about abusive my word just went away. Subjugation. Anyways, we're talking about a mature person willingly submitting themselves to another. Why would they do that? Well, because they're aware of both parties' strengths and weaknesses. We're going to get into this more in just a minute, but men and women are different. Husbands and wives are different. Wives are strong where husbands aren't, and husbands are strong where wives aren't. And so willingly submitting to another means that you are aware of those strengths and those needs, and you're caring for those strengths and needs. He says, but as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wife ought to be to their own husbands in everything. So maturity and humility include submitting to your husband's authority. That's part of being a mature and humble, in this case, woman. Now, if the text stopped there, I'm sure that a lot of people would be really up in arms, but it doesn't stop there. Now Paul talks to the husband. He says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Now, there's a lot there said about Christ and the church. But what I want us to notice about the husband-wife relationship is that Christ is the husband's example of love. Now, did Christ love the church by saying, hey, I love you, now go make me a sandwich? That's not what he did, right? What did he do? Philippians describes it by saying, not seeing equality with God as something to be grasped or held on to. He humbled himself, taking on the form of a bondservant. And we all know how that happened. He was born to a poor carpenter's family. He grew and he served people. He took care of those who were weak. He healed those who were injured. He fed those who were hungry. And when the time came, he died for his church. Now I want to form this in a particular way. See, loving your wife as Christ loves the church means submitting yourself to your wife's needs. Now that's an interesting way to put that, because when we think about a man submitting to his wife, a lot of times we think about somebody who is, we might say whipped, someone who is, not masculine, someone who is not holding his position in the family. We're not talking about a situation where the wife is domineering and tells the husband what to do all the time. Think about how Christ acted towards his church. We had a need, right? We needed salvation. We see his prayer in the garden that he didn't necessarily have the desire to be painfully put to death. He said, if at all possible, let this cup pass from me. But not your will, or not my will, but thine be done, he said. We had a need. He subjected his desires to our need. He served us. Now, husbands, our wives have needs, right? And they're different than our needs. We don't always necessarily understand them, but we care about those needs. We serve those needs. And in so doing, we are loving our wife as Christ loved the church. Now, as we're all aware, immature men rebel against this concept, right? Immature men don't like this idea. They see submitting as giving up their masculinity. Now, an example of this that is somewhat humorous, but it drives the point home, is when your wife needs you to go pick up feminine products during that time of the month. And you've probably met those guys who say, I'm not going in that aisle no matter what. Well, why not? Well, it's not a manly thing to do. that person is putting his desires above her needs. He's not serving her needs. He's not loving her the way Christ loved the church. True maturity would serve the need, right? Christ washed the disciples' feet. See, this reminds us of our bigger context. It's not just this one situation, but being filled with the Spirit includes submitting to our fellow Christians. So it's not an unmasculine thing to do. It is, in fact, a mature thing. See, submitting to another does not mean relinquishing your personhood. Because you're serving your wife's need doesn't make you some less of a man. Paul says, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. See, again, it's not always easy to care for your body's needs. You know, our pride might tell us that we can subsist off of frozen pizza and Little Debbie snack cakes. But what's going to happen if you do that? You're not going to be healthy, right? So it takes maturity and humility to submit to your body's needs. You need some lean protein. You need some good vegetable fiber. You need a good amount of exercise to be healthy. Does it make you less masculine to take care of the needs of your body? No. Similarly, he said, loving your wife is loving yourself. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. See, loving your wife is part of loving yourself. This also puts immaturity into focus. When others especially when men treat their wives in an immature manner, it demonstrates a level of self-hate. See, a mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual strengths and needs. Husbands, you have strengths and your wife has needs. Similarly, she has strengths and you have needs. You balance each other out. And he says that very thing. He says, no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. We are united with him. Similarly, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They're joined together. See, God specifically designed men and women to complement each other's strengths and care for each other's needs. God designed us to be that way. We could go back and study back in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where God specifically says, man's got needs. Man is not good to be alone. He needed a helpmeet. And God designed us to care for each other's needs. He says this mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Now we look at these two relationships together, and we see a beautiful picture. Because the wife is submitting to the husband's authority and caring for the needs with her strengths. Similarly, the husband is submitting his desires to her needs, serving her needs with his strengths. The two are serving each other and are better off for it. They're stronger because of it. But then when one side or both sides break that pattern and become selfish and stop serving the other, then it becomes unbalanced and we have immaturity that causes harm. See, a mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual strengths and needs. And that's really a beautiful picture that God designed for us. But of course, the context doesn't end there. The chapter ends there, but the context doesn't. Next, we're going to talk about mature parent and child relationships. And again, he's going to talk up to the one who's supposed to be submitting themselves and then the one who's in authority. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. So, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Okay, we're all aware that immature young people rebel against this concept. I was there. There was a time that my parents would tell me to do something, and I'd be like, man, I don't want to do what they were telling me to do. Who are they to tell me what to do, right? They see submitting as giving up their personal freedom. Who are you to tell me that I need to be here at this time and not go to that place and all these things? Most of us have probably been there, right? It's not always easy to submit to your parents. And kids, talking to you now. Hi, kids. Yeah, it's not always easy to submit to your parents, right? They tell you things you don't want to hear. But submitting to another does not mean relinquishing your personhood. It doesn't mean giving up who you are as an individual. Notice what it says in the text. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Why? Why should you do that? So that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. You see, parents are trying to teach you maturity and humility so that you can have a good life, right? They're not just trying to be bossy old people who are trying to control you. Good parents want you to live a good life. They want you to go and go further than they have. And so it behooves you to submit to their authority. But again, that relationship isn't one-sided, right? He next says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. You ever wonder why it doesn't say parents, do not provoke your children? Or mothers, do not provoke your children? I personally think that it says fathers, do not provoke your children to anger because, quite frankly, mothers are more empathetic and less likely to provoke their children to anger. Men, we tend to be a little bit more brusque. We tend to be a little bit more gruff. We tend to care a little bit less about the emotions and the feelings of the children. So he tells us, don't provoke your children to anger. See, not provoking your children and raising them in the fear of God means submitting yourself to their needs. Again, not in a way that the children get to boss around the parents, but just like the husband caring for his wife's needs, men, fathers, we submit to our children's needs by recognizing that they need us. They need our attention. They need our time. And we have to put aside what we may want to be doing to care for their needs. And obviously, immature men rebel against this concept. Don't have to look far to see this. Fatherlessness has been on the rise in this country for the last 30 or 40 years. Immature men see submitting as giving up their freedom and masculinity. They don't want to take time to care for the kids. They don't want to take time out of their busy schedule to actually spend time with their children. Sometimes this looks like a man completely abandoning his family. Sometimes this might look like a man just working all the time and when he's home, not being there, but being in his workshop or off with his buddies or whatever. And the family getting 5 minutes of his time each day. And of course, what ends up happening? The man says, well, I'm making money, right? I'm serving their needs by making money. And I get that, money's important, but your kids need your time. They need their father's eye contact. They need his guidance, his instruction, his listening ear, his fun-loving, adventurous nature to go outside and roll around in the grass sometimes. They don't just need a paycheck. See, submitting to another's needs does not mean relinquishing your personhood. Submitting yourself to your children's needs doesn't mean relinquishing your manhood. Because a mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual strengths and needs. Now someone might say, well, what strengths do the kids have that I need? Well, to be entirely honest, playing with the kids in the grass is great therapy. Talk about releasing stress and getting the cares of the world off your plate when you have a little kid who's just overjoyed that you are there. That is great therapy right there. Not to mention when you're old, who's going to take care of you? It's a long-term investment. So we see the need for this humility and this maturity in the husband-wife relationship, in the parent-child relationship. We see that in all those relationships, you have to submit your desires to others' needs. And that looks different in these different relationships, but you have to do that in each of these relationships. So now Paul talks about a non-family relationship. He talks about a mature master and slave relationship. Now, we get to this point, and Americans tend to have a knee-jerk reaction when we use the word slave and master. And we automatically think about like an abusive situation. And so we go, well, I don't need to listen to this part, right? Because I'm not a slave, I'm not a master. I don't own slaves. My parents never owned slaves, my grandparents never owned slaves, and I'm not a slave. So I can just check out. So to make it a little bit more applicable to us at the moment, we're going to change this title to Mature Authority and Subordinate Relationship. Because quite frankly, we all end up in authority and subordinate relationships. Do you have a job? Then you have someone in authority over you. Are you a manager at that job? Well, you're in authority over somebody. And the church has authority and subordinate relationships. We have elders who are over us. They have authority over us. So, we read, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So, putting it in vernacular that is applicable to us, employees, be obedient to those who are your managers or your bosses, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service or men pleasers. There might be the temptation there, right, to do the bare minimum, to do just a little bit when the manager's looking and then to slack off. You've all probably seen the jokes on the internet, or maybe seen it in your workplace where someone's sitting there playing a computer game on their computer, right? And the manager walks up and quickly they pull up a screen that looks like work. And, oh yeah, I'm working, boss. And the boss walks away and they pull up a video game again, right? Hopefully none of us do that. But we've probably seen that sort of thing happen. If not in the real world, then in internet memes. Not by way of eye service or as men's pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now, we all know immature people rebel against this concept. All of us have been in work situations where we worked with lazy people. And they see submitting as giving up their personal freedoms, right? They don't want to show up on time because they like to sleep in. They want to get off early because they got things to do. They don't want to be inside working. They want to be outside taking a smoke break. They don't want to deal with customers. They don't want to deal with management. They want to do their own thing. We've probably all had those coworkers. They see submitting as giving up their personal freedom. But notice what the text says. With goodwill, render service as to the Lord, not as to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. You can almost hear someone making the argument, well, my boss is not a good boss. My master's not a good master. They're not nice. They don't do a good job leading. I don't want to follow them. Well, with goodwill render service as to the Lord, not as to men. Okay, so your manager may not be a good manager, right? Serve the Lord. Do your work not as though you're trying to please this one person, but as to the Lord. Why? Knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. So God is our ultimate rewarder. We may get a paycheck from this person on earth, but he will reward, God will reward our good deeds. See, we are ambassadors of God. And our managers and coworkers will judge Christ based on our actions. You ever thought about that? If you show up complaining and, always trying to skip work and always trying to get out of things, your managers might say, that person claims to be a Christian. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to have that in my life, so I'm not going to be a Christian. And they judge Christ based on our bad behavior. We don't want that. We want to be the best ambassador of Christ we can. That means doing our job to the fullest of our abilities and showing the love of Christ to our coworkers while doing it. See, submitting to another does not mean relinquishing your personhood. Showing up on time to the job, doing the assigned task for the assigned number of hours, does not make you less than human. It does not make you less than a mature adult. See, a mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual strengths and needs. Now you might say, well, in this situation, what strengths and needs are we talking about? Well, you need money, right? And they need labor, right? But you trade your labor for their money, and you both get what you need out of the interaction. You both have strengths and needs. Plus, maybe they're not Christians. And you might have the opportunity to share Christ with them through your good conduct. So as he's been doing, he talks to the ones who are subordinate, and then he's going to talk to those in authority. He says, and masters, do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So masters, do the same thing to them. So all the things said to the slaves apply to the masters, and give up threatening. So good leaders treat their subordinates with the love of Christ by considering their needs. It's interesting, I read a lot of leadership books, and this concept plays out. In good leadership, they consider the need of their employees. Maybe somebody is particularly good at one task but not at another, so you put them on the task they're good at. Maybe they have particular disabilities, and so you give them tasks that aren't going to hurt them. Maybe they have particular scheduling issues, and you work with their schedule. That's caring for the needs of others. That's showing the love of Christ in a way. But of course, immature leaders rebel against this concept, and we've all probably seen bad managers. They see submitting to others' needs as giving up their power and authority. You ever seen a manager who they take that list of times that you need off and they specifically schedule you on those times? Why do they do that? It's called a power trip. They're trying to say, well, I'm an authority and you're not. You can't tell me what to do. That's bad leadership. That's bad authority. They see submitting as giving up their power and authority. But notice what the text said. Masters, do the same thing to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. Now this is dealing specifically with the situation where both members of this relationship are Christians. A slave who's a Christian and a master who's a Christian. Now we may end up in that situation, right? We may end up being the manager over other Christians. We may be managers over non-Christians. We are ambassadors of God, whichever situation it is. And our subordinates will judge Christ on our actions. I've heard from far too many Christian employees and Christian employers that they won't hire from the church where they worship anymore. Because sadly, a lot of people think that if they work for a fellow Christian or that they hire a fellow Christian, that they can somehow mistreat that fellow Christian. It's ridiculous, but it happens a lot. That ought not be the case. We are ambassadors of God. And if we're in a managerial position, our subordinates will judge Christ by our actions. We want to give a good example of what God is. See, a mature person, you're going to be able to quote this by the time I get done. A mature person submitting to another demonstrates awareness of your mutual needs and strengths. And how much better would the world be if managers cared for the needs of their employees and employees cared for the needs of their employers, and everybody worked together to meet those mutual needs? That would be a mature world. Of course, we live in an immature world, so we have to be the mature ones in the immature world. Now, what we've seen in this, as we've been going through these three different categories of mature relationships, talking about the parent-child and the husband-wife and the slave and subordinate, the subordinate and authority relationship, we've seen through it all that each person in each of those relationships ends up having to submit themselves to the other in some way, shape, or form. It's different in each relationship, but each section has to submit their desires in some way. And similarly, each relationship has needs that can be fulfilled. See, mature people look out for the needs of those around them, no matter their station or relationship. If we claim to be mature, then we should be looking out for the needs of those around us, no matter what they are in relation to us. So by way of application this week, my friends, strive to put the needs of others above your own pride. And notice, I'm not saying above your needs. Your needs are important, but your pride. You may want to be domineering, but put that pride aside and serve the needs. You may want to be argumentative and rebellious, but put that pride aside and serve the needs. And here's the cool thing. As we all put our pride aside and serve the needs of those around us, no matter their relationship to us, all those relationships will go better. They'll be smoother, they'll be more healthy, and we'll avoid being those who cause harm. Now today, as we're closing out, if you have a need, maybe you realize that you've been immature in some relationship, and you want the help of the congregation to become more mature. We want to be here for you. We want to help you. Maybe you realize that there's some other need in your life that the church can help with. We want to be here for you. And maybe, quite possibly, you're not yet a Christian. And if you would like to learn more about becoming a Christian, if you would like to learn what it is to be a Christian or how to become one, we would love to help you. So if you have a need, whatever your need may be, please let me know as Patrick leads us in this invitation song.